We've been working on a new EIP 7640, in conjunction with Christopher Jeffrey and Boima Fambule. So this talk, we're going to be talking about how, sort of like high level, how the mempool works, sort of how we got here in terms of how the mempool works in reality today. Why does proposer-builder separation exist? What is the role? And then the proposed EIP and the effects, principally making intents more decentralized, encouraging greater proposer autonomy with reduction in trust in builders, greater mempool efficiencies, and creating more decentralization and account abstraction. So this is sort of what Ethereum's pending transactions getting into a block looks like. You can either go in directly or go through this like searcher relay whole MEV structure. So this isn't obviously how it's always worked, right? It sort of just used to look like this. How did we go from this to this? There's a lot of discussion about MEV, but ultimately, historically, it was always this client over here that sort of decided whether something got into a block. All this other infrastructure exists now. And what's the role of all these, centralized providers? What do they really do? Because before it was a peer-to-peer network. You broadcast your block, people gossip it, nodes gossip it along a peer-to-peer network, and then, the validators, verify the block, and then we're good to go. So we got here because we ultimately separated out creating the block, which transactions get into a block, and the blocks themselves, the validation, creation, and signing of these blocks. And a lot of people think it's because, well, we need to hide this MEV activity. If someone produces some type of MEV activity, then someone else can copy that trade and they want to hide it. That's not actually, if you think about it from a proposer perspective, it doesn't actually make sense. This is largely the rhetoric that we've heard from people. This is not, it doesn't make sense because if it's an activity that you need to hide from other people, then the proposers aren't going to be getting realistically like a high fee for that. Like the gas tip for that is going to be very, very small. It's actually only well-known activities, back running, sandwich attacks, that type of garbage that actually gets bid up. So if you're a proposer, if you're a validator, those are the transactions that you actually care about. If someone's doing some type of activity where they get some MEV, from a proposer perspective, like if they're the only one, I don't care. I don't really care about mining this block. So why do we have all this infrastructure? Right? Why do we have this whole notion of separation? And a lot of it is, if you're doing these types of attacks, that you need to bundle it, And account abstraction makes it easier to do this type of bundling without these types of entities. But this proposal is not actually an MEV proposal. This is not actually an MEV presentation per se. You can use this proposal in conjunction with account abstraction to resolve these use cases, but this is not a presentation necessarily on bundling. However, there is a need for intents, as we've heard in this space, and intents is largely a buzzword. We know what are really intents from a mechanistic perspective. A lot of people talk about intents from a use case perspective. Mechanistically, if you actually break it down, what intents are is the fact that you can propagate along some type of mempool or some type of pending transaction, which cannot be a valid transaction today. So in other words, this is a revertible transaction. This is an incomplete transaction, but it's still being propagated. So it's that, okay, this is not a real transaction or it's not fulfilled. We're going to propagate it. And then eventually it will change state due to someone else into a valid transaction. And that is what gets mined. So mechanistically, that's all this intent stuff is. Right? It's that, okay, it's not a valid transaction right now. We'll still share it, but we'll defer producing it into a block until it's valid. That's all it really is. Like a lot of people talk about it, but mechanistically, it's that simple. And in Ethereum, whenever people talk about intents, these are centralized providers. Straight up. That's what happens. You're talking to a server, and that server decides what happens with it, and you're sort of trusting them to do, correct behavior, so to speak. And maybe that should be decentralized, right? But really, if you look at why this structure exists instead of this, it's fundamentally about contentious transactions. And what do I mean by contentious transactions? It's that if many people are trying to get the same transaction in, think about your standard MEV, then you only want one transaction to get in, And to backtrack a little bit, like this is not a presentation about getting rid of MEV in its entirely. It's about making a more decentralized system instead of having centralized trusted providers. So when I talk about contentious transactions, let's give a simple example. Let's say there's an NFT being released on chain tomorrow at midnight. Whoever bids first gets it. Whoever like gets this into a block first, and the first one inside that block just gets it. It's that simple. Let's say 20 people want it. Now only one is going to win, right? So in the traditional Ethereum mempool, if you propagate this transaction and there's 20 people bidding on it, intuitively you'd be like, okay, let's put in a higher gas fee, right? Let's get this thing in before other people. However, if you do this, that means 19 other people will lose money from spending gas, right? And fundamentally, if you think about it, this is the core. When people talk about MEV, when they talk about this like proposer-builder separation, this is the real problem. If you break it down, this fundamentally is the problem that they're trying to solve. So you have all this, like all these builders, all these relays, and all this stuff because they need a market to form off of these people trying to get their transactions in. Right? So if these 19 people don't get their transaction in, a lot of these providers will say, hey, we'll withhold the transaction and not include it in a block, and we pinky promise to do that, right? That's all they're saying. It's just a pinky promise. And what happens as a result? What happens is that consequently, because these centralized providers have a promise to you not to mine this block, this means they cannot relay your transaction to other people. And that is where the network effects of centralization comes in. That is why, on a fundamental level, there's only 4 or 6 or so builders out there. Because these builders cannot share your information. That is the core of this design. That's really all it is. So why do we have it this way? Right? Like, why do those 19 people have to pay if you broadcast it along the Ethereum mempool? It's simply denial of service protection. The P2P is an open gossip network, the Ethereum like P2P, for pending transactions. And, the state of the transaction is not really known until it's included in a block. Because, for example, if there's 19 other people trying to get it in, well, when you broadcast the transaction, you don't know if you're the winner. So as a result, you have to pay for the revert in order to make it so that there's no denial of service in the mempool. Because I could flood the mempool with transactions that are ultimately invalid. And this solution of reverting transactions and always paying gas, it's a very simplistic solution, but it's worked. But because of this problem, people have devised other centralized solutions. A transaction lifecycle can be broken down into, you sign a transaction, your local wallet produces it, and then there's a relay policy, and this is oftentimes overlooked. And this is a very, very important point where in order for a transaction to go from one node to another before it's mined, before it's produced in a block, there's a policy established inside the peer-to-peer nodes on whether to send this to other peer-to-peer nodes, the pending transactions. An example is there's a maximum depth of pending transactions per account. So if you've got an account with let's say, 100 pending transactions, you blast it out there, well, it'll only go up to about 75 or so. And then, the proposer decides what to include. And then at that point, after it's included in a block, it can either be reverted or a valid transaction. Now, the fact that there's a separation between reverted and valid transactions is fairly interesting because there's three sort of major filters, whether it gets propagated on the P2P level, and then whether it gets reverted and whether it's valid. What's fairly interesting is oftentimes the constraint around the P2P layer is higher than what is accepted in a block. For example, the block can include 100 transactions from an account, but it's not allowed in the P2P layer. So here's the proposal. It's incredibly simple. It's incredibly simple. It's not a lot of lines of code. It's simply a new transaction type proposed in Ethereum, hard fork core consensus change. And it's simply having a field called revert protect. And if a transaction has revert protect set, then it cannot be included in a block. If it's included in a block, then that is an invalid block. It's sort of like including in a block like a bad signature or whatever it may be, right? And that means that you are now free to propagate these transactions among random untrusted parties because you know your transaction will only get in if it does not revert. However, we need to address this denial of service attack problem. That was the original problem that we're looking at. And it's a very simple rule. If I'm a standard Ethereum node today, without an alternate mempool, the default behavior will be to not relay the transaction and not accept the transaction. And therefore, there's no real impact in terms of existing nodes with no alternate mempool. And then there's an additional opcode to detect whether the flag is set in the EVM. So in order to construct these alternate mempools, what an example would be, you have some type of, public mempool in addition to the existing mempool. It looks a lot like it, except there's flow controls. So if you're an account, let's say you're staking 32 ETH, you can broadcast it along a certain amount, maybe let's say 1 per minute, or whatever the flow rate is. And then you also have a priority queue algorithm attached to it. So if someone's flooding the network with an account, you sort of downrank it and make it so that only higher priority transactions go through. And this is a true peer-to-peer network. We're not talking about a new token model, no new validators, pure P2P, right? And you can run this in addition to the existing Ethereum P2P network, and it basically looks pretty much exactly like that. The minor difference is you can add intents to this, but that's a whole nother discussion. Additionally, by having this change in, if you wanted to use the existing MEV infrastructure today, you're reducing the trust in these MEV providers. And what do I mean by that? Because you're trusting ultimately the MEV providers not to relay these transactions to other people, right? Today, that's what's going on. With this change and something like account abstractions or another EIP, you can have an environment where these MEV providers, these builders, are willing to just share your transactions willy-nilly to other people. And why is this important, right? We only have 4 to 6 of these people. With this change, you could potentially have thousands of these builders. There's no real reputation attached to them right now. Right now, there's trust imbued in the block builders. And that fundamentally breaks the system in the long term, because what happens is that these people are withholding block data because they can't trust the proposers, and as a result, there's some risk in the system in the long term. And hopefully this can create a new wave of decentralized mempools, a new wave of innovation on intents, and building things on the P2P layer. Because the P2P layer is sort of like, it's a cobweb of code. And I think we need a great deal of innovation to bring Ethereum back to the forefront when it comes to intents. And I think we can get back to this. This is really what we can get back to, I think. And so what are some use cases? Decentralized market formation and P2P mempools. That means that, that NFT example you saw earlier, people just bid up their gas fees. They're just the gas tip. You just start increasing that. It propagates. Everyone can see that. And the P2P network, you can just get a view on whoever the current, potential winner is. You don't need to rely on these, centralized parties. And it creates the opportunity for true decentralized intents. Like I said earlier, intents are invalid transactions today that may become valid later, which need to be held in the mempool. And right now, you're just hitting some HTTP server for these intents. They could reorder, withhold your transactions, ignore you, front run you. You might not even know. And at least on a P2P mempool, it's very, very public. And you bid it up via gas fees, and it's very straightforward. And it creates greater proposer autonomy and greater innovation. Proposer autonomy meaning that if you're signing a block, maybe you should know what's in the block. Maybe you should be building that. And this NFT example is why we don't have that. And we need more secure, decentralized account abstractions. Account abstraction is getting in soon. It's going to be popular. It's going to be interesting. And right now, the account abstraction has a fundamental trade-off between having only one bundler for your account abstraction contract or you relying on these builders. And the reason why this constraint exists is because their transactions can get reverted. If you're bundling 50 transactions to save gas in account abstraction, if one gets reverted, you're kind of messed up because you paid the fee for that transaction, you paid gas for it, and none of those 50 got in. What do you do, right? That's kind of messed up. So you have to use these centralized builders. And that's fundamentally baked into the account abstraction design today without a change like this. So in terms of community process and how you can help, the EIP was just uploaded a couple days ago. Please review, comments appreciated. And if you're building dApps, I do think intents are coming. I think it's a big deal. I think you should be biased towards decentralized approaches. And decentralized approaches means you're operating on a public mempool, or maybe even the builders are publicly gossiping your transactions. And hopefully this can push forward Ethereum towards a more decentralized future. Thank you. Questions? All right, thank you.